So in the Middle East, the Trump administration announcing hard-hitting economic sanctions on Iran. As the war secretary says, the use of military force still in play. Chief Forest correspondent Trey Yingst joins us live from Tel Aviv with the details. Trey, how did that big announcement go over yesterday?
Yeah, hey, Brian. On Monday, Secretary Treasury Scott Bessent announced Operation Economic Outcast, a U.S. plan to isolate the Iranian regime. Among the new sanctions that were announced are secondary sanctions that are actually targeting a variety of different assets, including technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. In addition, the Treasury Department sanctioned nearly 60 entities, individuals, and vessels in multiple jurisdictions. The actions go after what the department describes as a network of shadow fleet vessels operating across many different countries. Iranian officials threatened retaliation to the economic measures, with the country's foreign ministry spokesperson saying this.
Any complicity with the United States in carrying out its aggressive actions against Iran will certainly have consequences. Even now, the naval blockade of Iran amounts to an act of aggression. Any escalation of this situation will undoubtedly bring about consequences of its own.
Earlier this morning, another tanker was struck in the Strait of Hormuz with an unknown projectile while transiting the U.S.-approved southern route. The vessel had damage caused to its engine room and was disabled. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth warned Iran against taking further provocative action on Monday.
If Iran is foolish enough to overplay their hand or mess with the American military, we'll do what we need to do. But economic pressure, we know, hurts them the most right now. But by no means are we foreclosing using kinetic strikes anywhere in the Strait of Hormuz or around Iran.
We're also tracking another development in the region. Syria has been taken off the U.S. state sponsor of terrorism list. This was met with praise by Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara, who said his country is focused on rebuilding. Brian?
All right, Trey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone. Iran now faces a very clear choice with only two paths before them: complete global isolation and a subsistence economy, or a path back to normalcy with an opportunity to rejoin the global economy. Today, we are launching Operation Economic Outcast to foreclose every other option available to the Iranian regime.
All right, there you go. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announcing Operation Economic Outcast. Here to break it down is the co-host of the Big Money Show, because it is all about money right now, Fox Business' own Taylor Rakes. Taylor, great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So overall, what did you think of the announcement? What did you think of the press conference?
Really good. So I think Scott Bessent was really good. He came out and he said, we're not going to name names. We're doing behind-the-scenes diplomacy. But then he called out a couple people like the UAE that took action last week, started cutting off Iran. When a reporter asked him about it, he said, that may not be a coincidence. It actually may be more causation of some of the phone calls that we're making. He also said that we'll be expecting another big bank to come out by Friday and also talk about sanctions. We're looking at maybe Hong Kong, Dubai, or Singapore as some of these countries that are going to start to cut off Iran. He mentioned just quickly the Berlin Wall, and he said the Berlin Wall fell when soldiers stopped shooting their own people. I think that was a call out to the IRGC. If you stop getting paid, what's your motivation to shoot your people? If you just stop, that gives that country and the people a chance to uprise and sort of pull down that Berlin Wall metaphor.
The problem is the IRGC are the worst of the worst. They are true terrorists.
Yep.
All right, so they want to financially isolate Iran. And one of the big things with this is the UAE coming aboard right away. That's the number one trading partner. They refine most of the oil that Iran has, and they are the number one exporter and importer of Iranian goods. So that is huge. The targets, oil shipping, technology, gold, and digital assets. They do a lot with cryptocurrency, don't they?
They do. So here's the one concern that I have. When we were putting sanctions on Russia, they said, okay, fine, we won't use the dollar. We're going to trade in yuan, the Chinese currency. So they were able to evade a little bit and go into things like crypto or some of these other dark assets. So I just want to be sure that when we're putting sanctions and cutting off Iran from the U.S. financial system, the dollar, that they don't then go just turn around and use a BRIC currency or a Chinese yuan. And so I think that could be sort of the backhanded, unintended consequence. And when you use the dollar as that negotiating tool, make sure that they can't get around it, a la crypto.
We don't want people to get off the dollar as the world currency. And also, there's, I guess, 2 trillion real for every $1. So that's crazy. U.S. 2 million. U.S. warning the countries and companies and banks that do business with Iran sanctions and losing access to the dollar system.
Yes.
I'm wondering what China's going to do. That's going to be big.
Still, though, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. So even though the yuan has been trying to come in and make plays, there's nothing that competes with the dollar. All
right. In current action now, we know the number and the Iranian economy. We see that their relevance there to their currency. And then we see the annual inflation is out of control. You think you're upset with 3% inflation? How about 90? And finally, look at the countries that do trading, to do deals with Iran. This is the big one. They're supposed to, President Xi is supposed to come here in 3 weeks. Will we put pressure on them and jeopardize that relationship?
And the only other caveat to that, China is the 3rd largest holder of our debt after the UK and Japan. Now, they only hold about $630 billion of treasuries. That's 2% of our debt, but we need them to buy our debt. But still, I don't think that they would retaliate in that way. But China is the biggie to watch, given the trade tensions that we have.
India, listen, we're giving you about a month to go somewhere else for oil and gas. The president's got a great relationship with Modi. He has a great relationship with Erdogan, but they have not broken up their trade deals. And also, when it comes to Pakistan, they actually did a deal with Iran a few weeks ago, and they want to be a mediator.
How much does this pressure and pressure from the UAE start to turn these things around? That'll something we'll be watching in the next couple months.
And the president says he's got a great relationship with Qatar. Time to call those guys out.
I agree.
The U.S. announcing Operation Economic Outcast. The goal here to isolate Iran by economically choking it off from the rest of the world. The Trump administration unveiling dozens of new sweeping sanctions and warning other countries and companies against doing business with the regime. Just moments ago, President Trump saying Tehran is already feeling the squeeze, posting, quote, "The failing Islamic Republic of Iran is not paying large segments of their military, while at the same time killing protesters, even when they're not protesting, at levels not seen before. It is a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions and must be stopped now." Joining us now to talk about this, Jonathan Schanzer, the executive director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a former U.S. Treasury terrorism finance analyst. Jonathan, good morning to you. Thank you for joining us today. So the goal with this is to cut off basically every single source of revenue for Iran, and other countries are starting to get on board with this. We just saw over the weekend the UAE announced they're suspending all trade with Iran. We're talking about $6 billion worth. Do you see that as a game changer?
It is huge. I mean, first, let me just say, I think the regime is already in bad shape, and I think we can see that because the currency is now at 2 million to the dollar, and you just get a sense that we've done a huge amount of work voiding out, 40% of their GDP through some of the strikes. Now we're looking at the additional pressure being heaped on by Secretary Bessent, Donald Trump, and the rest of the Trump administration, and I got to say, the UAE looks like it is a pivotal place to start. This is a country that, despite the fact that it's normalized with Israel, despite the fact that it is a close ally of the United States, they have allowed Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah. I mean, we see assets of the Iranian regime parked over there in the Persian Gulf. And this is the way that the regime has been accessing the U.S.-led banking system. You cut that off and you get a sense that the regime is going to be in really bad shape. It's not the only place where they do business, but it's a convenient place, and it actually amounts to real money. This could be a game changer.
Yeah, Iran's economy has been getting absolutely crushed. Their inflation rate right now estimated to be at about 66%. You mentioned the Iranian rial, the value of which is just plummeting. 2 million Iranian rials for every single U.S. dollar. And then take a look at this chart right here, going back to early 2025. This is how that Iranian rial's value has fallen off a cliff since the start of last year and continuing through the war with Iran. Just give us your reaction to looking at that. I mean, even after the MOU fell apart, you see it nosedive even further.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I think this all points to is that the fundamentals of the Iranian economy have been in shambles for quite some time. I mean, before the war, it was in bad shape. Now it's even worse thanks to the pressure that the Trump administration has been heaping on. In some ways, this is just a race of two different timelines, right? The Iranians think that they can outweight Donald Trump, that they think that maybe the drop in munitions, the spike in the price of oil, the pressure from the midterms, that's going to squeeze the president and perhaps get him to capitulate or make a bad deal. And now what we're seeing is that maybe it's actually a different timeline. It's the timeline through which the Iranian regime collapses economically and maybe even politically as well. Look, at the end of the day, I know that the Trump administration doesn't like to talk about regime change, but I got to say, if we continue to heap this pressure on and to isolate this regime, it's actually quite possible that it does collapse. And if you ask me, that would not be the worst thing.
China gets a whole lot of crude oil from Iran, and yesterday Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked directly, is China above these sanctions? What are you going to do if they violate it? Here's what he said.
Is the very delicate trade truce with China something that could prohibit you from going that far and taking that very big step?
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions. That if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted.
Jonathan, got about 30 seconds left here. Your thoughts on that answer? He essentially says China will be retaliated against if they don't play ball here.
Look, we've already seen a handful of entities in both mainland China and Hong Kong that got hit with sanctions yesterday. I'd like to see some small banks, then medium-sized, then large banks if the Chinese don't comply. We've got a summit coming up, high drama there, and I hope Donald Trump sticks to his guns.
All right, got to leave it there. Jonathan Schanzer, thanks so much for coming on this morning. Appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you, Todd.
Now to the Middle East, the Trump administration is preparing to unveil what they're calling the economic asphyxiation of the Iranian regime through a new wave of secondary sanctions.
Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst joins us live from Tel Aviv with the details. Trey.
Yeah, hey guys, good morning. On Monday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Operation Economic Outcast, a U.S. effort to isolate the Iranian regime.
The actions of Treasury and other agencies will tighten the noose and block every potential source of revenue that funds the IRGC and the evil Iranian regime. And let me be clear, any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the U.S. dollar system. The clock just started ticking.
Among the new sanctions includes an expanded list of secondary sanctions targeting digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. In addition, the Treasury Department sanctioned nearly 60 entities, individuals, and vessels in multiple jurisdictions. The actions go after what the department describes as a network of shadow fleet vessels operating across many different countries. Iranian officials threatened retaliation to the economic measures, with the country's foreign ministry spokesperson saying this.
Any complicity with the United States in carrying out its aggressive actions against Iran will certainly have consequences. Even now, the naval blockade of Iran amounts to an act of aggression. Any escalation of this situation will undoubtedly bring about consequences of its own.
Early this morning, another tanker was struck in the Strait of Hormuz with an unknown projectile while transiting the U.S.-approved southern route. The vessel had damage caused to its engine room and was disabled. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth warned Iran against taking further provocative action on Monday. We're also tracking a number of other developments in the region, including a decision by the United States to remove Syria from a state-sponsored list of terrorism. Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara responded, said his country is focused on rebuilding and redevelopment. Guys?
Okay, Trey Yingst live for us. Thank you, Trey. And we're going to bring in former NSC Chief of Staff under President Trump, Alex Gray. Alex, thanks for coming on to talk about this. So basically what the administration's plan is to bring Iran to its knees, both economically as well as with, threatening military strikes. Is this going to be enough to get Tehran to just lay down and say, okay, enough is enough?
Well, I think it's actually going to be a really significant piece of finally forcing the Iranian regime to recognize reality. And the reality is that they have limited cards to play. They've pushed their people to the brink of collapse, and there's really not much more that they can do realistically to counter the United States. What President Trump has understood here, and he has a very sophisticated understanding of history, is that the United States consistently wins wars when we use not just our battlefield capabilities, we use our economic prowess as well. We did it in the Civil War, we did it in World War II, we did it in the Cold War, and we're going to use our market power, the fact that everyone in the world wants access to U.S. banks, U.S. currency, U.S. commodities imports. They want access to the United States, and that is an ultimate tool we have to compel Iran to finally recognize the reality of their situation.
Right, and I keep bringing this up because I think it's a very important thing to bring up, but you have the complete other issue of who in the world is even in charge in Tehran and who is making these decisions. I've said this countless times. I know a lot of people have, and that is obviously an issue that that people are honing in on. But my question is, how could this affect the world economy? Obviously, we have to end this war. This has to stop. It has to stop. But is this going to affect the U.S. in any way, shape, or form?
Well, I agree with you completely, and I think the president, as much as anyone, wants to bring this war to a conclusion. He's accomplished most of his objectives, and using our overwhelming economic power is a great way and a historically sound way to bring it to a conclusion. I think the way that this is going to play out from an economic perspective on Americans and on the United States really more has to do with how our trading partners and how countries like China and India and others are going to react. And ultimately, we've heard a lot of speculation. Will the Chinese follow through on this? Will they actually listen to what the president and Secretary Bessent are saying? The Chinese government's not going to actually stand up and say, we're going to comply with this. But individual Chinese companies are going to make a very clear decision. They're going to decide, do you want to be with the Iranians, a collapsing, decrepit regime that offers nothing, or do you want to maintain access to the United States market, to the dollar, to the U.S. financial system? And I think besides all the rhetoric and the posturing, companies all over the world, including Chinese ones, are going to make a very clear decision here.
Yeah, China might be our adversary.